I worked for many years in Columbus City Schools. I started out as an ESL teacher at the middle and high school level, and then I became a district teacher coach that worked mainly with middle and high schools, and I did help to design our Newcomer program. It was not just me, I was part of the team, and I had visited several Newcomer programs back in the 80s and 90s when I first started hearing about them. Every year I go to TESOL, unless when I was teaching there were a few years I couldn't go because of testing. But every year that I could go, I went, and I always do a site visit because I learned so much by seeing how things are done in other schools. So I visited the one in Long Island City. I've been to one in Boston, which is no longer around. We visited a couple in Minnesota and Minneapolis and Rochester when we were starting ours, because we had mainly a Somali population. We had about 65% of our students were Somalis. And when they first started coming to our city, the school system was in shock because we had all of these students who not only didn't speak English, but many of them had never been to school. They had left Somalia during the war and had gone to Kenya. The refugee camps were not pleasant places to live, so most of them were sort of living underground, like a lot of our undocumented students are. But in Kenya, if you are not a citizen and you don't have the right documents, you may not go to school. So they were sitting in apartments or wherever they were living, waiting for permission to get out of Kenya and be resettled somewhere. So many of them were coming to the U.S., obviously, because we take more refugees than any other country. And I think Debbie mentioned before that we are one of the sites in Columbus that had a large secondary migration. So they might be resettled wherever through the resettlement agencies. So we had a number come from San Diego and Seattle and so on. But when they got to those places, they found out that the cost of living was very high. There were not a lot of jobs that they could do without good education and a lot of English. So the word was out that Columbus was a place to go. So they were moving. We now have between 40 and 45,000 Somalis living in Columbus. We also recently started getting students from Nepal, and we have somewhere between 20 and 25,000 Nepali students also. So we are a large refugee site. So that was the driving force behind starting our Newcomer program. So it's very different from what I've visited. I've been to the Fort Worth International Academy. Yesterday I went to a middle and a high school in Galena Park, and I spent some time in some classes there, and it was almost all Central American, a lot of unaccompanied minors and so on. That was the students who were coming as newcomers there. So we are getting some of those students, believe it or not. I was telling somebody at dinner the other night that we have three areas that have a lot of unaccompanied minors in Ohio. One is Columbus, one is Cincinnati, and the other is Amish country. Who would think that unaccompanied minors would end up in Amish country? But they are coming from some small villages in Guatemala where they don't speak Spanish as their first language or indigenous languages. They're coming to a chicken processing plant. So we have like 200 middle and high school students living in this area that's right in the middle of Amish country. So they're starting a Newcomer program as well. So today we're going to talk about the history of Newcomer programs. I'm going to go into that a little bit. Who are our new arrivals? How do we know if a Newcomer program is right for your school and school district? So we're going to spend a little bit more time on your specific situation. What does an ideal Newcomer program look like? And what do we do about students with that limited and interrupted education, because they're the ones who have the largest gaps and have the biggest needs. Okay, so I found this picture on the internet, I don't remember where, but I thought this is what school life looks like to a student who is brand new to the U.S. Obstacle after obstacle. It's like, how do I even get from one class to the next? How do I read my schedule? What in the world do I have to do to get out of here eventually? So I thought that was very appropriate. And hopefully, somewhere in there, we've got our Newcomer teachers helping the students to navigate. Oh. So who are these newcomers? As Debbie mentioned before, we have students who come in with grade level education. We probably had 10 to 15% of our kids who met that criteria. Students with gaps in their education, a larger percentage, and then those students with little or no formal education. And so each of those students needs a different kind of program. So you need to think about your particular situation when you are designing your program. So who do you serve? So if you want to just talk to your neighbor for like 30 seconds, what kind of population are you working with? Another opportunity to talk to your neighbors about which population you are working with. So a little bit about the history of newcomers. The first that I heard of or know of, and it doesn't mean that this is the most that we know of, back in the late 60s and early 70s, there were starting to have some newcomer programs that made it into research. In 1979, the Newcomer High School in San Francisco was founded, and I remember seeing I think it was a TESOL journal, and had a picture of the Newcomer High School with some students on it, and I thought, wow, what a great place to work, not knowing that someday I would actually be in a newcomer school. And then, of course, the two studies that Debbie and Beverly Boyson did, the first one on just newcomer studies, where they are and who they serve, and then the second one was a little more intense on case studies of schools. So the two people that actually did the first studies on newcomer programs, one was Heidi Chang and the other was Monica Friedlander. So Heidi Chang did the study in 1990, and she found out that language learning alone is not enough to help a newcomer succeed. And so she saw that schools were finding out that just putting a kid in an ESL class, for many students this was not enough. They needed some more intensive assistance. They may have limited or interrupted schooling, maybe even in their native language, and they may need some kind of adapted or redesigned curriculum to help them to catch up to their peers. She also found that newcomer programs can provide psychological and social supports. So a lot of our kids are coming having experienced trauma. If nothing else, just for an average teenager living in Houston, if you move from one side of the city to the other, for a teenager, that's trauma. I've lost my kids, or my students, my peers, who am I going to hang around with, and what are they going to think about me, and what do I wear, and all that kind of thing. Can you imagine coming from another country and being a teenager, how difficult that is? And then helping the families and the students themselves with other kinds of support. That schools have social workers and they have counselors, but sometimes they don't understand the unique needs of these students. I remember many times, even in my own school, the counselors would bring all the juniors or seniors together and they would start talking about college, and we want all of you going to college. And I would see some of the kids just sliding down their seat, and I thought, hello, do you not realize some of these kids, that's not an option for them. You are just reminding them of this. It was very frustrating. And I know they did it with the best of intentions, and I'm sure they couldn't figure out how to say it and not hurt somebody's feelings, but I could just see the faces of some of the kids that really bothered them. And then Monica Friedlander, she, in her study, said that she thought newcomer programs were a temporary and transitional program that would meet those unique needs of students. And it operated on the premise that English language development was not enough. So she said we need something beyond your typical ESL class for these students. And I love this one. She said it was a temporary stopover at cultural and educational shock absorber. And I love that term. Because it really is. If you go back and talk to students, and I was just reading last night a book called Portraits of Promise. I don't know if any of you have read that. It talks about, I think, 7 or 8 students who have been successful, and they went back and interviewed them and what had helped them. Every one of them said they could remember that first day in school and how traumatic it was for them. And, and actually almost every one of them said that what made a difference for them and what kept them in school was a teacher who really took them under their wing and helped them to feel welcome, and that made a difference for them, and they were willing to then keep fighting and going on. She also said that Newcomer programs offer an array of academic and support services that are specifically tailored to newcomers. And again, that is a critical piece. Okay, so why are newcomers growing? Newcomer programs growing? We have 2 major stimuli. First of all, you've got many kids coming with less and less academic skills, less literacy in their first language, and you've got the increasing level of the academic requirements. Somebody asked about how do you help the kids meet those standards. You know, those standards, I keep saying they bring those standards right up here to the neck of the kids. It just kills them. And the teachers too, like how do I get these kids to a certain level, and you know, I'm going to be rated on this. My scores are going to decide whether or not I even have a job next year. And so we understand the pressure on the teachers, and there's the pressure on the students. And if we can get some kind of remediation through a year or 2 of giving them a break where the pressure is off for these students so that they can have a chance to catch up. And I do think that ESSA is going to help that, so we'll see. So we have students with significant academic gaps that they pose challenges to the districts that cannot be met with traditional programming, and that's when you end up needing a newcomer program. So why do we need them? They help students focus on literacy development, hopefully both in native language and English, filling in those academic gaps, being that cultural shock absorber to the students, and helping the families feel welcome. When I worked at the middle school, where I was just one teacher, a pull-out program, and it was parent-teacher night, I would maybe have 2 to 3 parents come in. I mean, they were just rare birds. You hardly find them. And it was usually the parents of the students who were doing well anyway. So when we started our newcomer program and we had parent night, the parking lot was packed. Families were there. I mean, it was amazing. Partly because we had people who were serving as translators. So we had probably 12 different languages represented by employees in the school. And that made a huge difference. The parents felt like somebody could understand them, and they felt welcome. So it made a big difference getting the parents into the school. Okay, so how do you know if your school or school district needs a program? So in your folder, you have something called a needs assessment. And there are 8 questions here. And when I do longer workshops, we spend some time on each of these. We're not going to have a lot of time to do that. But you can at least look down through these. And I'm going to give you time to sit together with a shoulder partner and think about these 8 questions. How many new arrivals do you get every year? If you only get less than 20, you may not even need a newcomer program. Those students may be able to be absorbed in what you've already got. If you're getting more than 50, you probably need this kind of a program. What about the language background of your new arrivals? Are they all of the same language background? Then a bilingual program would be appropriate. Are they mostly from the same background, a few others, or are they a real mix? So you need to think about that when you're deciding what kind of language program you're going to have. Where do they live? Do they all live in one area? Do they live in 2 parts of town? Are they mixed? In the school district where I lived, we had about 3 different parts of town where most of the students lived. but they decided to bus them all to a central location. We already had a lot of cross-town busing. It was commonplace, so it wasn't something new for the parents, something new for the community. And so busing everyone to one location worked out for us. What are the age of your students? What's the educational background? What is the English language proficiency? How is your district currently serving those new arrivals? A says the current program is meeting the needs. Well, if it is, you're probably not at this workshop because you don't need this. If maybe it just needs tweaking, just needs a few modifications, what you're doing is working, maybe you just need one more period to help the students or one additional teacher, or it's not working at all and we need to come up with some new program, some new plan. And then finally, what is your district philosophy for Newcomer program? In my district, they were willing to consider putting all the students in one location and working with them. There are two large suburban school districts that are adjacent to ours, and in both of those, they said, we talked about having Newcomer programs, they absolutely said no way. They didn't want to bus students from one school to another. One ended up having some school within a school programming, although they don't really call it Newcomer programming. And in the other one, the students were just mixed in with all the other ESL students. So every school district has a different philosophy, and you have to, if I were starting one today, I would start at the top. Start with the people that have the power to make some decisions. If you can get them on board with what you're doing, it makes it so much easier. Otherwise, you're battling and you're probably going to lose because they got the power and you don't. Okay, any questions on this? All right. So the activity was to complete the needs assessment, which you can do on your own time. And then, now I'll give you a couple minutes to sit with your shoulder partner and talk about, in your list, what did you see? Is there anything that stands out to you that you really hadn't thought about before? You think your current program is working? How much does it need to change or tweak? Anyone see a real need that they hadn't thought about before? Okay. Okay, so how do you decide if you need a Newcomer program? A lot of this is what Debbie talked about before. You need to think about where you're going to put it. Is it going to be one in every school where you have newcomers? Is it going to be couple different parts of town? Is it going to be one central location? How long will the program be? Will it be within a school, separate site, whole site? What grades? We did not have an elementary program. We only had middle and high. We tried an elementary twice, and it didn't work. But I don't think it was because a newcomer program for elementary doesn't work. I think it was because of how it was introduced. It was told to the principal of the building, you will have a newcomer program and we will give you a teacher. That was pretty much it. So, good luck. So in one school, the principal says, oh good, I can put all of my ESL students in one room. And that's what they did. And the ESL teacher goes, this was not the plan. You know, all the newcomers and the level 4s were all together in one room. That was not the idea. In another one, the teacher did have just newcomers, but once they were in there, they wouldn't let them out. They stayed the whole year. And the teacher kept saying, I have these students that, you know, I've made a lot of progress, they're ready to be out to be mainstream, and there was no consideration. I don't know if the classes were full, I don't know what happened. But at the end of the year, we said, okay, that was a disaster, and we stopped it. So I think rather than looking at what worked and what didn't and tweaking it, they just totally stopped the program. I think there are definite ways to run an elementary program, and we have somebody here who does an elementary and middle program. Want to stand up, at least they can see who you are. She does a 4 to 8 program, so those of you that are thinking about elementary, you might come up and meet her later.
Been around for 11. I've been the school principal for 11 years now.
Okay.
Anyone else? Her district will be presenting in the World Cafe.
All right. Anyone else have an elementary program in your school district?
Side
Pardon?
for ISD.
Okay.
North side.
North side?
Bush Creek. North side.
Okay. I have a friend who used to work at Goose Creek.
We're at Thomas Community School. It's a charter school.
Okay. And what grade?
It's elementary.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So we have lots of people here that if you want to have a chance to meet with them, and if you're thinking about an elementary program, they can tell you what they're doing now and what works and what doesn't. I think it's always a good idea to find out before you start what doesn't work and start from there and work on whatever's going to work with your students. Okay, course offerings. This is critical, and I love what Debbie was talking about with the pre-9th grade. When we first started, we were going to be a 1-year middle school program and a 1-year high school program. They were 2 different sites. Our 1-year high school program, we were going to do sheltered courses and ESL. So it was going to be algebra, physical science, American history, world history, and ESL. I would say within a month, the teachers were coming to me and saying, this is not working. Mainly because we had all of these refugee students who had very little previous education, and they were in an algebra class, as she mentioned. And the teachers were going, no matter how much we adapt the curriculum, you can't teach algebra to somebody who can't do, they could add, maybe even double digits, maybe. Multiplication and division, no. They didn't know that X and Y were numbers and 1 and 2 were letters and 1 and 2 were numbers. I mean, you just can't do it. So, and they says, even if we would really adapt the curriculum to give them a credit for Algebra 1 at the end of the year, and then they're moving on to geometry, how do we do that? So they says, we have got to come up with some other program. So in our school, what we did was we came up with the same idea, what we call them lab courses, just because at the time we had a state test that the school district allowed us to have high school courses that prepared kids for these tests, and they gave them like credit for it. So they had a math lab, they had a science lab, they had an English lab, which were really like glorified kind of study hall test prep classes. So we put the kids in these courses, and we could, because they had no curriculum established by the district, we could teach them what they needed. So if the kids were at 1st grade level math, We worked on that, built them up, hopefully up to at least 4th grade or 5th grade math by the end of the year, getting them ready to move on. For science and social studies, we taught them the vocabulary for those courses, some basic skills, how to do a lab experiment, how to keep a lab journal, all those kinds of skills and vocabulary they were going to need when they moved on to a regular high school course. And it really worked well. For most of the kids, even those with very little education, that was very successful. But we had one big issue. The students were angry at the end of the year. They were still grade 9. Because in Ohio, it's not based on your age. You have to have so many academic credits to move on to grade 10. So we explained, yes, you have credits. Yes, they will count for graduation. And then we would try to explain the whole system, which most teenagers don't get, that you had to have like 16 academic credits and you could have 5 elective credits to graduate. We said, look, you've got all of your elective credits. Now you can move into your required courses. We even have a program that grade 11 and 12 could be done in 1 year with double courses. We could get you out in 4 years. But they were still angry that they had to do 9 and 9, 10, and then 11 and 12. And no matter how many times, they still didn't get the math because it's still 4 years. But I'm 9th grade again. Yes, but, and I swear half of them would get angry and want to leave the program just for that one reason. And no matter how many times we tried to explain it, it just did not sink in. I think we needed to do more at the beginning to explain what was going on. But when we tried, they didn't get it then either. And we tried to explain it to the parents, and the parents didn't understand how credits equal, they thought I did 1 year, now I'm moving on to grade 10. Just like, you finish grade 4, you move to grade 5, doesn't work that way at high school. That was our biggest problem with courses. Length of school day, we did a whole day, and then we did after school, we had Saturday, we did every extra thing we could think of, but I didn't think about the vacation institutes, although I don't think teachers would go along with that. Did you give up spring break to teach? Probably not. And then coming up with a daily schedule. So we looked at curriculum development, material selection. Again, those were 2 big issues. Even yesterday when I visited the 2 different schools, I asked them, what is the main thing that you still consider as an issue for you with your newcomers? And they said the curriculum. That even though they had a good, solid curriculum for first level ESL, they said it didn't fit for the newcomers. That they really needed some basic, my name is, and these are the colors and the numbers. The kind of things you just have to learn when you need to learn a new language. That they were trying to push them right into content courses and content curriculum, which is a great way to teach ESL. I love it. But they needed a little bit of that orientation and basic ESL right at the beginning. And they said they felt like the students weren't getting that. I don't know how to mix those 2 together, but they felt it needed to be done. Material selection, finding good books. There are a few out there, but they are few and far between. Career exploration and internships. We tried to get our students into career centers. We were having lots of problems. If the students didn't have enough English, even for like auto mechanics, I would go to the career teachers and they says, have you seen the auto mechanics books today? They're this thick and you need a college degree to read them. It's technology and computers. It's not like taking the carburetor out and cleaning it anymore. So they said, there's so much knowledge that the students have to know before they can do even those kinds of courses. So it was a frustrating experience. We did not have enough interaction with native speakers, and that, I think, is one thing that caused problems with our school. It is important for them. We did allow our students to stay to grade 12, and by the time they became 10th, 11th, and 12th graders, they had very good English. They were the models for the brand new students, but we still didn't have native English speakers, and I think if you can find a way to get that interaction, that's important. And we had lots of expanded learning opportunities. Administration is critical. A couple times through the years, We had a principal that was put into the school, I think because the district didn't know what to do with them, quite honestly. And they thought, oh, this school, it doesn't have any kids, and they don't have a lot of district problems. We'll put this administrator over there that doesn't seem to do very well at the school, and we'll let them run the school. In our middle school, 1 year, we had a lady who, very nice lady, but she really believed that you should grade according to the standards. So she told the teachers that she wanted no student to get anything above an F if they were not working at grade level. I thought if they were at grade level, they wouldn't be in the school. The whole school's not at grade level. It was so frustrating. But the people that were above her and were also above me, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. So it was a very frustrating situation. So you need somebody that understands second language acquisition and that is willing to work with the students, work with the teachers. Fortunately, in our school district, they were requiring everyone who worked with the newcomers to have TESOL certification. And we were also fortunate enough that in Columbus, because we have Ohio State right there in the heart of the city, we had a contract with Ohio State that anybody who worked for our school district could take the TESOL endorsement courses for free. So we could put that criteria on teacher recommendations because we'd say, we'll hire you as a math or science teacher if you're willing to take these courses. And most teachers were willing to do that if they were interested in working in that school. And then we were able to get teachers who really knew how to work with these students. So that was a real plus for us. So we even required the gym teacher, the technology teacher, all of them had to have TESOL certification. We had a number of paraprofessionals, and they are critical. You need people in the school that speak the languages of the kids. Debbie mentioned this before. Although we never had a secretary that spoke any language other than English. And the man who was in charge of the ESL program, who is still in charge of the ESL program, he used to put signs up everywhere. English only, speak English. Just cringe. It just, but there was nothing I could do. He was my boss. It's like, do you not see a problem with it? But anyway, so the kids would come into the office and would be asking for someone to explain their situation in Spanish, and you go, speak English, speak English. Just stop here. I'm supposed to speak English. Hello. And support staff, as we mentioned, secretary, counselors. So critical to have counselors that understand your students and their needs. One of the biggest issues in high school is looking at transcripts and giving them the equivalent for the U.S. courses. And I found a couple of books, and actually New York City has a great downloadable, like a handout or brochure or booklet that was put together for counselors on how to read transcripts. It's wonderful. It's like 100 pages or something. But it goes through all the different countries and what you could look for. That in some countries, it's not just saying, okay, this word means U.S. history, or obviously they're not going to U.S. history. This means world history, but they'll give them like a 5 or a 10 or a 25. And it's like, what is that? So every country has different determination for a grade. In many countries, a 10 is the best you can get, and a 5 is passing. Well, for us, that would be 50%. But in other countries, a 5 is passing, you're okay. So we had to go through and look at each of these countries and try to determine which transcripts gave kids credit, because the more credit you can give them, obviously the faster they get out. Parent-community liaisons, very important. Our nurse, one of the most important jobs in the school. We had to fight with the school district for a full-time nurse, but the school would say, the district-wide, it would be like one nurse for every 400 or 500 students, and we would have smaller numbers of that. but they didn't realize what kinds of issues our nurses would deal with. And it wasn't just that kids had different kinds of medical issues, although sometimes that was the case, but following up on appointments and so on. Our nurse spent half her time driving kids to appointments and so on because either the parents weren't available or they didn't understand why, okay, they've been to the doctor once, that's good enough. Many of them come from countries where they had not had a lot of medical attention in the past. Looking at preventive medicine was not something that they were used to and that kind of thing. So it was really important. The nurse did so many things for our students with glasses and with hearing aids. I had a number of students with hearing issues because they had been in refugee camps. They'd had ear infections and so on that had built up in their ears, and they had lost their hearing. So they needed to go in and have some checking done on that. And social workers, we did not have a social worker. I fought the whole time I was there to get a social worker and could not get one. And I thought of all the jobs we needed, that was probably one of the most critical. But, so if you can get a social worker, it's really important. Other things, physical health, we talked about. One of our students, one of our top students, one day was walking around the high school and couldn't say her name, started having problems walking. They got her into the nurse. The nurse thought she'd had a stroke. And so we called the parent. We got an ambulance, took her to the children's hospital. They put her in isolation because they thought she had TB and that had gone to her brain. I mean, and we're going, oh my God, this is one of our best students, this poor girl. You know, we were all worried about her. Found out later she had trichinosis. I said, who gets trichinosis? I mean, we hear about it, but she had lived with her family next to a pig farm, and somehow had gotten trichinosis and had gotten into her brain. So as soon as they figured out what it was, they got medication and she was fine. But it was really scary for a while. So those are the kinds of things that, you know, we had students with malaria, lots of students who've been, had TB and were on the medication for TB. So, you know, you need people who understand those tropical diseases and so on. Health services. We were fortunate enough to be connected to two different groups that actually brought psychological health services into the school, because the families many times would not allow the children to go to any other kind of counselors and so on, because there was a stigma against those kinds of things in their country. And so if we could bring them into the school, then the parents would agree and they would sign off on it. But to take them somewhere else wasn't going to happen. Special ed services, we mentioned that before, that's critical. We even had clothing, school supplies. In our school this year, they had a sock drive because many of our students come from warmer countries where they only wore flip-flops all year round. They would come in the winter, in the snow, with flip-flops, and sometimes socks and sometimes not. But they had no other kinds of shoes. So we started a drive with socks, and they were giving out socks to the students. School supplies, book bags were given to all the students at the beginning of the year because most of them were refugees and they did not have school supplies. And then we mentioned the students separated from their family. We did have a few unaccompanied minors. And then we also had students who were in refugee camps who had lost their family, and they were coming unaccompanied as well. And then students who work, we had a lot of older students living by themselves or living with 2 or 3 other guys. They were working at night, and so we had to adapt the schedule so they could come in later or leave earlier, because otherwise they were going to have to drop out because they had to work. Entrance and exit criteria. For the placement, we use the same test that we did for the whole district, and then if they were a level 1, which is the lowest level on the test, they were recommended to our school. And we did not have another assessment tool once they got to our school, and that was something that we really need. And I wrote down the name of that the test that's in New York, because we also did not test them to see how much education and literacy they had in their first language, and I think that would have been something that we if I were doing this again, I would have divided kids that had more education and put them in separate classes because those kids move so much faster, 2 to 3 times as fast as the kids with less education. We did not do a lot of student monitoring. Once they left, we did not know who did well and who didn't. And again, that's something that I wish we would have done and been able to do more of. I know that the new ESSA, they're saying that they want like statewide placement tests and somehow tied to the exit test. Exactly how that's going to work, I'm not sure. So if you're creating a program, these are things you need to think about. You look at the students, and that was part of that needs assessment. You look at the district resources and what is available, and then you put those together and you come up with whatever kind of newcomer program works for your school. So how are you going to do the language delivery? Will it be bilingual, ESL, or both? When and where are you going to have your program? Who is going to be working there, and what kind of support services. So those are all the things you need to think about. So also in your packet, you have a piece of paper with those same categories down the side. And then across, it will say, for example, under language and learning delivery options, you could have ESL, ESOL, or ELD. You can have bilingual. You could have native language literacy. All these across, those are your options. So as you're thinking about what program you're going to create, just circle what you would like to do. These are some of the options you need to think about. For structure design, are you going to have it within a school or off-site? Will it be half day or full day? Is it going to be a semester or more than a year? Who's going to be the staffing people? And what kind of support services are available? So those are just things to think about as you create your program. So as you made your program, set it up, then you start thinking about, okay, what do we have to do day to day to make sure this works well? So this is a list that a friend and I created of 5 best practices for working with newcomers. And we said, number 1, you need to have the school personnel work together to make this program. So that's what you're doing on that list. And then you're going to figure out how you're going to involve the teachers to create intensive literacy, numeracy, and content area support. And one of the things that we did at my school that I thought was the most effective of all the things that we did is we brought in elementary trained ESL teachers, and they did little guided reading groups for students 1 period a day. It was wonderful. You'd think that high school kids would go, huh? They loved it. They did picture books, they did some worksheets, but they did the alphabet, the numbers, all those kinds of basic ESL, basic literacy kinds of things that the students needed. That's when they were getting it. And they really enjoyed it. It was 3 days a week, about 45 minutes a day, but it was very, very effective for the students. Numeracy, we had basic math, and then we moved on up to the other kinds of math. Developing a ladder of supports, so helping the kids move up. And in my school, every 9 weeks, we would look at the students, we would give them tests that we had created ourselves, and decided who got to move up to a higher level. Because we wanted to make sure that they were receiving the instruction that was appropriate for them. So they weren't trapped in one level. And that also helped them to access those grade level standards. We always consider the standards as the goal. This is where we want them to be, and then what are we going to do to move them up to that standard? So you can't just start with that standard because they're 14, you're going to learn this. You know, you've got to work up to that. So you've got to build a foundation, and then you've got your ladder going up to that standard. We did a lot of training of the school staff and providing non-academic support. We offered lots of opportunities and lots of personnel. We brought in people from other refugee resettlement organizations and social service agencies, and they would come in and make partnerships. We had once a month, we brought in people from around the county for a advisory council to find out what was going on in the community and how we could connect to that, and then they also found out what was going on in the school. So it was a way to connect to the community. And we worked as much as possible with the families to help the students outside of school. So we would have workshops on how do you graduate from high school? How do you get the credits? What do testing scores mean? Why is it important to read to your children at home? You know, I'm sure you've all heard, I've had parents or teachers that would say, you know, read to your children at home in English. We're going, what? That's not very realistic. So we would bring the parents in and say, you know, it's fine if you speak nothing but your language at home. We are not telling you to speak English at home. That is not what we're saying. Speak to your children at home because they need to develop that first language. Read to your children at home in your first language because that will help them to learn English faster. So we gave them a validation of their first language to explain it to them because unfortunately they were not getting that same message from other people. Okay, and then I want to finish with talking about interrupted education. So there's three different terms that you might hear. One is SIFE, which is Students with Interrupted Formal Education. That's what it stands for. That sort of started in the New York East Coast area, but it's kind of moved across the country. Limited Formal Schooling, or LFS, was a little more popular in the Midwest and the West, although I think SIFE has sort of overtaken it. And then a new one that's coming out now is SLIFE. And it was by DiCaprio and now Helene Marshall. They worked together on some books on students with limited or interrupted formal education. So whatever you call it, it's the same idea that students have gaps in their education and how do we help them to fill those gaps. So these students are usually recent arrivals, probably 2 years or less, interrupted or limited schooling in their home country, limited literacy in their native language, usually below grade level in math, although not always. And unfortunately, because of that, they're usually doing poor academic achievement as well. And this is from Freeman's book called Bridging the Achievement Gap. Causes of interrupted or limited formal education, war. And unfortunately, there's more wars going on today in the world than ever before. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. Relocation. Sometimes it's just that kids have been in the U.S., but they've moved around so many times. They may have had poor education in their home country. The teachers might not have been trained as much as possible. They may have had breaks in school. There might have been strikes, or they were far away from the school. They couldn't get to the school, whatever. Lack of English proficiency, and then some children choose to work instead of attending school. So who are these kids? There are two main groups, mainly the Latinos, the immigrants from Mexico and Central America, although actually I would include the Dominican in there as well. About 500,000 students, or people, not students, people a year come from those two areas, and about a third are children, and 60,000 approximately are unaccompanied minors. 2014 we had about 60,000, the number dropped in 2015, and it's going back up again. Often these children come from rural areas. They may have had inconsistent schooling due to poverty, but not all are SIFE, just some of them are. And then our refugees. Traditionally, we've had about 70,000 people a year coming in as refugees. Just last year, that number went up to 85,000. It's been recommended it goes up to 100,000. Who knows if that's going to happen, mainly because of the Syrians. You know, Europe now has, I think, close to over 1 million. Turkey has almost 3 million refugees. Jordan has over 1 million refugees. I mean, there's almost nobody left in Syria. There were 8 million, and I think there's like 3 million left. Literally, you can't live there. There's no government, there's no support, it's obviously dangerous. They are getting out. I just spoke to a friend, Heidi Chang, she's on the nominating committee for TESOL. She works for IOM, International Organization of Migration in Switzerland, and she was just on her way to Turkey for their 3 million people that are now in Turkey from Syria. Can you imagine if we had 3 million people coming in and within like 2 years from another country, people were screaming. They're screaming now, and it's not like that. And then we also have students who are coming as asylees. So they may leave their country, come here, and then request to stay. So they are called asylees or political asylum requests. And so those get added in as also refugees. Many times they have spent years in refugee camps with limited access to school. When we talk about Latin America, many Latin American countries only have compulsory education up to grades 8 or 9. And that includes the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. Often families have to pay for the uniforms and textbooks. So even though the school itself is free, if they can't afford the uniform or they can't pay for the textbooks or they can't afford the transportation costs to get to school, they will stop attending. And in many rural areas, they have poor facilities, poorly trained teachers, and there's little enforcement of school attendance. So even though it may be required to be in school to grade 9, they may not attend. I saw it, there was a book I bought at TESOL last year by Marguerite Lutz. If you haven't seen it, I brought a copy if anybody wants to see it. She talks about students with interrupted education from Latin American countries. And she did this graph came from her. So she says in the United States we have 12 years of compulsory education and 96% of our kids attend high school. Now, they may not all graduate, but at least they start out in high school. In El Salvador, it's only 9 years of compulsory education, but only about 14% are still attending by grade 7. And yesterday I was working with 2 students who were working on a PowerPoint presentation on their life for the Newcomer class they were in. And one of the boys was from El Salvador, and he was showing his dad with his diploma. And I asked him if it was his bachelor degree, which is like high school. And he said, no, grade 9. And he was so proud that he had graduated from grade 9 because that really is, for most kids, as far as they go. Guatemala actually requires 11 years, but only about 25% are still attending after grade 6. In Honduras, they have 9 years of compulsory education, but school fees and gangs are keeping a lot of kids out of school. One of the girls that I've been working with as a pre-service teacher who's doing their student teaching had been 2 or 3 times to Honduras in the last couple of years, and she had lots of pictures that she was showing us of schools in Honduras, and she said that the situation was horrendous for a lot of the students. And then in Mexico, although there was 9 years of compulsory education, only about 66%, or 66% do not complete grade 9. Okay, so how do you overcome this? So we got immigrants with some academic skills. Sometimes they only need to make up for a couple of years, so it's not that difficult. Some concentrated coursework is going to usually bring those kids up to speed pretty quickly. They do need maybe sheltered instruction or some after-school tutoring or something like that, but usually by the 2nd or 3rd year, they're pretty much on track. But those students who are lacking rudimentary literacy skills, those are the ones with the big challenges. And they may need years of intensive work. And that's what we found when I said we first started with 1 year middle, 1 year high. We found out by the middle of the first year that was not going to be enough. So we asked the district, can we keep them for 2 years? Eventually we were able to keep them, and we had a whole full school from grades 6 to 12. But last year the district cut that back down. We're back to a 2-year program. So what would an ideal program look like? Oh, we talked about that already. That's on the slide. So questions?
Thank you so much, because it's been, this has just been very enlightening. Something that we're seeing with our unschooled kiddos that are older is obviously how much motivation they have to do things outside of the classroom on their own once they take ownership of their own learning. How much did you see, if any, programs that took advantage of free websites, Khan Academy, different things, and actually spending time making sure the kiddos were computer literate quickly with inexpensive, like everybody has a phone. And it might not be a phone that has data, it might just be a camera.
Well, most of them do.
Well, many don't. Many wait till they get on the school, grounds, and then that's when they have. But there's so much that they can access to ramp up, Starfall and different things that you wouldn't think that they would want to do, but they have. That's one gift that they bring, is a huge appreciation for education, at least in the beginning. If we don't beat them out of it. But I mean, how much did you see of that? Of specifically getting kiddos literate with what they can do on their own when properly motivated?
They became computer literate very quickly.
They do.
They do. Now, that was never usually an issue. The first few weeks, yes, but after that, it was pretty tough. But for students who were older, we had after-school programs, we had Saturday programs. The middle school kids would come in droves. We would park a bus and they would hop on, anytime they had a chance to come to school. By the time they were 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, you couldn't keep them in school with a gun. I mean, when school was out, they were gone. Sometimes they had jobs. I don't know where the other ones were going. Maybe they just didn't tell us they had jobs, but trying to keep them to do any kind of extra work, even the ones who knew, if you don't pass these 5 tests, you will not graduate. We could not keep them after school to do that practice test. We couldn't get them there on Saturday. They would come in the summer after they should have graduated as seniors. Then they go, oh my God, maybe I need to study for these tests. And they would stay and frantically try to pass these tests. We had students coming back for a year or two after just to take 1 or 2 more parts of these tests because they didn't graduate until all 5 parts were passed. But as they got older, it was harder and harder to get them to do any kind of extra work. Yes? Keep her happy.
My question is, those of us that represent elementary schools, our students are very motivated to do everything. Does that help with thinking perhaps the elementary situation, we should have more schools for newcomers? Because it seems like you're saying the research doesn't support school for newcomers for elementary.
No, we were just saying we hadn't studied them. We're not saying it's not a good thing. I think it's a great thing. I think everyone agrees it's a great thing.
But there's no research.
No, nobody has done the research on elementary. But they are motivated, so they will make progress very quickly if you can put them in a program that's appropriate for them.
So I often hear from districts they want to better serve their newcomers, part 1. Part 2, they want a newcomers program. But I hear less about the connections between the newcomers program and what happens after that, and how teachers throughout the school know how to support newcomers even when they're no longer in that program. Can you talk a little bit about those kinds of connections?
I didn't do a lot of work out in the schools after they left. I know we have probably 20 high schools, but most of the kids went to certain ones because of where they lived. So those schools had sheltered programs. We called them satellite units. So there would be 1 or 2 ESL teachers there, and then we tried to have a math and science and a social studies teacher who would work with students who were like intermediate level. So the beginners could stay at our program. Once they felt comfortable, they could leave if they wanted or they could stay. And if they left, they would go to those sites. I think for the most part, they did very well in those sites. It was the students who decided that they wanted to go to, we had 2 or 3 really top schools where, 80 and 90% of the kids were going on to college and so on. When they felt like those were the schools they wanted to go to, we had 5 kids one year go to one of those schools, and within a month they were gone. They had just totally dropped out. And it was because that school was not supportive of those students. They could care less, and they were all of the mindset of, you're here, work hard, it's up to you. And those kids did want to work hard, but they needed some additional support and they weren't getting it.
I think some of those answers you will find this afternoon, whoever had the elementary programming. But it is true, at least in Texas, we have, many schools have bilingual ESL programs. You reach a level where you're exited out, and then that's where we see the drops in the research shows there are drops in grades. That's why that study that I'm telling you that we're conducting right now on academic proficiency profiles, that's going to give us a lot of information, and also our early warning system for English learners on where those risk indicators are. Where do you need the strongest supports for the younger L's and the newcomers? But we're out of time. So I want to thank Dr. Custodio for her presentation. And I want to share a little bit of information